In Arlington, Virginia, the Hale family lived the kind of life everyone admired. Their small brick house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees and white fences. On weekends, the smell of barbecue filled the air, and neighbors waved from driveways. It was the picture of normal American life in the early 1960s during the tense years of the Cold War. Richard Hale worked as an aerospace engineer under a defense contract connected to the U.S. government. He spent his days working on aircraft systems and came home every evening at 6 sharp. His wife, Marianne, gave piano lessons in the living room, the sound of soft music filling the house every afternoon. Together they had 3 children, David, Emily, and little Sarah, who ran through the yard chasing each other until dinner was ready. Every detail of their life seemed calm and predictable. Richard took pride in that. He liked order, schedules, and quiet evenings. The news often spoke of spies, secrets, and Soviet infiltration, but he never imagined any of that had anything to do with him. Marian appeared to be everything a good wife was expected to be. She was gentle, organized, and always smiling. The neighbors loved her. She baked cookies for church gatherings and helped anyone who needed a favor. Richard often thought he was lucky to have a family untouched by the world's chaos. But sometimes, as he worked late at his desk, he noticed small things that didn't fit. A faint tension behind her smile, a moment of distraction when the phone rang. He ignored it. Everyone had their secrets, he told himself, and she deserved her privacy. Still, the feeling lingered, like a quiet echo under the sound of the piano. Something small, something off. It was a perfect life, yes, but sometimes perfection hides the deepest cracks. And soon Richard would discover that behind the walls of his quiet home, another world existed, one built on lies, loyalty, and betrayal. It began on a cold winter afternoon. Snow covered the streets, and the children were building a snowman in the front yard. Richard came home early from work, brushing snow from his coat, ready for a quiet evening. Marianne was in the living room, sorting through mail. Her piano students had just left, and the house smelled of coffee. She smiled as he entered, the same warm smile he'd seen for years. But that day, something felt different. When Richard went to the study to put away some documents, he noticed a small desk drawer that hadn't been there before. It was new, neatly installed, and locked. The sight stopped him. Marianne never locked anything in the house. Not drawers, not cupboards, not even her purse. "New drawer?" he asked casually, trying not to sound suspicious. Marianne paused for half a second too long. "Oh, that. Just old letters and receipts," she replied with a quick smile. "Nothing important." She turned away before he could say anything else. It was such a simple thing. A drawer, a smile, a pause. But for Richard, it stirred something deep inside, an uneasiness he couldn't shake. Over the next few days, he began to notice more small differences. Her handwriting looked slightly different on the grocery list. She spent longer on the phone, sometimes lowering her voice when he walked in. And there were nights when she said she was visiting a friend, only to return hours later, tired and distracted. Richard told himself not to overthink it. Maybe she was stressed, maybe it was nothing. But the pattern kept growing, one small inconsistency after another, each one tightening the knot in his stomach. One evening, he opened his notebook and began writing dates and times. When she left, when she returned, what she said. It felt wrong to spy on his wife, but the silence of the house seemed heavier now, the air colder. Something was changing. He didn't know what yet, but the calm, safe world he built was beginning to feel fragile. And for the first time, Richard started to wonder if his life was not what it seemed. The pattern grew clearer with every week. Marianne's errands became longer, her stories shorter. She used to shop at the same grocery store down the street, always back within an hour. But lately, she returned after 2 or 3, sometimes without the things she said she went to buy. When Richard asked, she'd laugh softly and say, "You know me. I always forget something." But Richard didn't laugh. He started to keep a quiet record. In his notebook, he wrote, Tuesday left at 3:15 p.m., returned 6:20 p.m., claimed grocery store closed early. He noted the pattern again on Friday, then Sunday. The pages filled slowly, his handwriting tight and controlled, the kind of writing of a man holding his thoughts inside. Marianne's piano lessons also began to change. A few new students appeared, people Richard never met. They came at odd hours, sometimes late in the evening, carrying no music sheets, staying less than half an hour. Once, when Richard returned home early, he saw a tall man in a dark overcoat leaving their front door. Marianne said he was a parent of a new student, but she couldn't remember the child's name. The more he tried to ignore it, the more it consumed him. He watched her from behind his newspaper as she poured coffee, noticing how carefully she folded notes into her purse. He listened to the tone of her voice when she answered the phone. Calm, almost rehearsed. Still, every time he looked at her, part of him wanted to believe. This was Marianne, his wife, his children's mother, the woman who smiled at him across candlelit dinners for 15 years. Surely there was an explanation. But each night as he turned off the light, he thought of that locked drawer, the sound of the key turning, the hesitation in her eyes. Something was happening, something she didn't want him to see. And Richard Hale, engineer and loyal American, decided that the only way to protect his family was to start watching his wife. It happened one quiet night after everyone had gone to bed. The wind howled softly outside, and the only light came from the small lamp on Richard's desk. He had finished some project papers and reached into Marianne's drawer to find a pen. The key was still missing, but the lock was simple. He managed to slide it open with a thin screwdriver. Inside, he found the usual things: stationery, sheet music, a few receipts. But tucked beneath them, wrapped in tissue paper, was a roll of undeveloped film. Richard stared at it for a long time. It was nothing unusual. Families took pictures all the time. But something about the way it was hidden made his hands tremble. He slipped the film into his coat pocket and closed the drawer. The next morning on his way to work, he stopped at a small photo shop on Wilson Boulevard. The young clerk promised it would be ready by evening. Richard spent the whole day distracted, running numbers on aircraft blueprints while his mind circled back to that roll of film. When he returned to the shop that evening, the clerk handed him an envelope with a polite smile. "You take some interesting photos, sir," he said casually. Richard didn't respond. He opened the envelope in his car, his breath fogging the cold windshield. The first few photos looked normal. The children, the piano, a neighborhood picnic. But halfway through the stack, everything changed. There were photographs of documents, pages stamped confidential, blueprints of aircraft parts, and aerial maps of restricted zones. His heart pounded. He recognized some of them. They were from the very projects he worked on. Richard sat frozen, the photos trembling in his hands. His wife, the woman who kissed him goodbye every morning, had somehow photographed top-secret material. He couldn't breathe. The world outside looked the same. Cars passing, lights glowing. But inside the car, something shattered. Marianne wasn't who he thought she was. And for the first time, he felt the Cold War wasn't something happening out there. It was happening inside his home. After that day at the park, David knew he couldn't keep pretending. Every time he looked at Linda, he saw the lies behind her calm smile. But he also saw the woman he had fallen in love with, the mother of his 3 children. He felt trapped between love and fear, unsure of which was stronger. One evening while the kids were asleep, David sat in the living room holding the small recorder. The evidence was there: the coded messages, the secret letters, the late-night errands. But turning her in meant destroying his family. If she really was a spy, there would be no coming back. He thought about confronting her. Maybe she'd explain everything. Maybe there was a reason. But deep down, he knew there wasn't. The world was too divided for accidents. The Cold War had turned truth into a dangerous thing to uncover. That night, he wrote a long letter to the FBI. He didn't sign his name. Not yet. He described what he had found, when he found it, and the strange signals from their home. Then he placed the letter in a plain envelope and drove to a public mailbox 2 towns away. He dropped it in and stood there for a long moment, watching it disappear. When he returned home, Linda was waiting by the window. "You're late," she said softly. David nodded, avoiding her eyes. She stepped closer, studying him as though she could see through his thoughts. "You're hiding something," she whispered. He forced a small laugh, but she didn't smile back. She only said, "If you ever lose trust in me, remember, some things are better not to know." That night, David didn't sleep. He kept thinking about her words. Somewhere between love and loyalty, he had chosen the truth. And he knew that soon, someone else would knock on their door. 2 weeks later, on a cloudy Thursday morning, 3 men in dark suits arrived at the house. They flashed badges, FBI. David's heart dropped. The letter had reached them. Linda was making breakfast. When the agents asked to speak to her privately, she didn't seem surprised. She wiped her hands, adjusted her hair, and followed them into the living room. The children watched quietly from the hallway, too young to understand what was happening. For an hour, David sat frozen at the kitchen table. He could hear muffled voices through the walls. Questions, short answers, and the sound of papers being unfolded. When the agents finally came out, one of them turned to David and said, "Thank you for your cooperation, sir." Linda looked calm, almost peaceful. "It's fine," she told the children, forcing a smile. "Mommy just needs to help these men with something." They led her out the door, and the cold air rushed in as it closed behind them. David stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. Everything felt unreal. The quiet house, the smell of burnt toast, the sound of his children whispering. He wanted to believe it was a mistake, that somehow it would all make sense later. But that night, when the agents returned for more questions, the truth unfolded. They had been following Linda for months. She had been passing coded information about U.S. trade policies to Soviet contacts. Every note, every late-night trip, it had all been part of her mission. David listened, numb, as they explained that her case would be classified and that his cooperation had likely saved him from being charged. When they left, he walked into the living room, where the typewriter still sat on her desk. He touched it gently, then closed the cover. The home that had once felt safe was now filled with silence, the kind that comes after the truth finally speaks. Linda was taken to a federal holding facility in Washington, D.C. For the first few days, David heard nothing. The house felt empty, but the silence was heavy, not peaceful. When the phone finally rang, it wasn't her voice. It was an FBI officer asking him to come in for questioning. He drove there the next morning, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. Inside a small gray room, 2 agents waited with folders stacked on the table. They asked him about everything: her routines, her friends, her phone calls, her piano lessons. Every simple memory now felt suspicious. "Did she ever talk about Russia?" one agent asked. "Not really," David replied. "She said she hadn't been back since she was a child." The agent nodded slowly. "That wasn't true," he said. "She traveled twice in the last 10 years. Both times under a different name. David felt dizzy. He had shared his life with a stranger, a person who had built walls around every truth. "Was any of it real?" he asked quietly. "We think she cared for her family," the agent said, "but her loyalty was never to this country." When David left the building, the cold air hit his face. He stood in the parking lot trying to remember the woman he thought he knew. Her laugh, her voice reading bedtime stories, her hands on the piano keys. It all felt like scenes from someone else's life. That night, he tucked his children into bed and told them their mother had gone away for a while. He didn't say why. He couldn't. The youngest asked, "Will she come back?" David hesitated, then whispered, "I don't know." As he turned off the light, he wondered how long it would take for the truth to stop hurting, or if it ever would. Months later, the trial began. The story spread across newspapers. Suburban mother accused of spying for the Soviets. The neighborhood that once waved kindly now whispered when David passed. Reporters camped near the gate, flashing cameras whenever he left for work. In court, Linda appeared calm. She wore a plain suit, her hair tied back neatly. When the judge read the charges, espionage, conspiracy, and aiding a foreign government, she didn't flinch. She even smiled faintly when her lawyer whispered something to her. David sat in the back, hidden beneath a hat and sunglasses. He didn't want the children to see any of it. As witnesses described her secret meetings and coded reports, he felt as though he was hearing about someone else entirely. But when they showed photos of her passing documents to a man in a park, his breath caught. There was no denying it anymore. When it was her turn to speak, Linda's voice was calm and steady. "I did what I believed was right," she said. "I never meant to harm my family. But some truths are bigger than one home, one marriage, or one country." Her words struck him like a knife. Even now, she believed in her cause. Even now, she chose the mission over them. After weeks of testimony, the court delivered its decision. Guilty. Linda was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The courtroom fell silent, and David felt the world collapse inside him. As she was led away, Linda turned her head slightly. Their eyes met one last time. For a brief moment, she looked like the woman he had loved. Tired, fragile, human. Then the guards led her through the door, and she was gone. When David walked out of the courthouse, the winter sun was shining, but it gave no warmth. He knew life would go on, but something inside him had ended. Quietly, completely, like the closing of a file that would never be reopened. The months after the trial felt slow and heavy. David tried to keep life normal for the children. Breakfast at 7, school drop-offs, bedtime stories. But the house felt colder now. The laughter was gone, replaced by the quiet sound of moving on. The neighbors who once waved no longer did. Some avoided him completely, pretending not to notice when he passed by. At work, people spoke in low tones when he entered the room. He had not done anything wrong, but he carried her shadow everywhere he went. Every now and then, a letter would arrive from the prison. The handwriting was neat and familiar. Linda wrote about the children, about small things, the weather, books she was reading, songs she remembered. She never mentioned the trial. She never said she was sorry. David read the first few letters but then stopped replying. He didn't hate her. He just didn't understand her anymore. The woman he had married was gone, replaced by a name that appeared in Cold War reports and spy documentaries. One night, he found their old photo album in the closet. There she was, smiling on their wedding day, holding their first baby, laughing by the piano. For a moment, he wished he could forget everything, go back to the days when life was simple and trust was easy. But those days were gone. The truth had changed everything. Years later, when the children grew older, they began to ask questions. "Why did Mom go to prison?" the eldest finally asked. David took a deep breath and said, "Because sometimes people believe in something so much, they forget who they might hurt." He didn't say more. Some truths he knew were better left quiet. Decades later, after the Cold War ended, David's story became part of history, a forgotten chapter in the long shadow of espionage. He was older now, gray-haired and slower, but sometimes he still thought about her. In 1994, a journalist came to interview him for a book about Soviet spies in America. "Do you regret turning her in?" the journalist asked. David looked out the window before answering. The sky outside was clear, quiet, nothing like the tense years he remembered. "I didn't turn her in to punish her," he said softly. "I did it to protect my children, but I still think about her every day." The journalist nodded, scribbling notes. When she left, David walked to the piano, the same one Linda used to play. He sat down and pressed a few keys. The melody was broken and uneven, but familiar. He realized then that love and betrayal could exist in the same memory. The Cold War had ended, but its scars still lived inside people like him. People who had been caught between duty and emotion, loyalty and love. That night, he took out the final letter she had ever sent. It was dated years ago, but he had never opened it. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside were only a few words. "I never stopped loving you. I just loved my country more." He folded the paper gently and placed it back in the envelope. Outside, the world had changed. The flags, the fear, the secrets, all had faded into history. But inside one small house in Virginia, a man still lived with the quiet echo of a war that had never been fought on battlefields, but around dinner tables and inside hearts. And sometimes when the night grew too still, he could almost hear her playing the piano again, the sound of love, loss, and loyalty blending into one final song.